We now have the opportunity to hear from John and from Paul Kengor and from Jeff Lord. Paul Kengor is a professor at one of the truly great colleges in this country, a college that is not riven by the kinds of dissent that we see at the Ivy League, at Columbia. I don't think you have at Grove City anybody who is celebrating the Palestinians or anything like that. Paul is also a prodigious author. He's written nearly 20 books, a couple of books on Reagan in particular, and I'm interested to hear from him in a few moments about his perception of the Reagan movie, which is basically founded on Paul's scholarship and his work. He is also involved with American Spectator, and he is truly one of the intellectual bright lights of the conservative movement. Jeff Lord is now with Newsmax and American Spectator. Jeff has been in Pennsylvania. He is from the area. He lives nearby. He goes back to the days of working on John Heinz's campaign. He has been around the conservative movement. He was at CNN for a number of years as sort of the lone conservative voice at CNN. He is a man of integrity and perception, whom I think is uniquely well prepared to speak to us today on his perception of where our nation is going. So we are going to have a lively conversation for the next 30 or 40 minutes, and I'd like you to welcome all three of them now. Thank you. I'm going to begin by asking each of the three of these distinguished gentlemen to give their perception in just a few words of the first, not even 100 days yet, but the first 75 days of the current Trump administration and where you think it might be headed from there. You've observed a number of first 100 days, but I don't think you've ever seen one quite like this set.
Yeah.
So let's begin with Jeff and go on down the line.
Well, one of the things I learned working for President Reagan is that when a president takes office, it's sort of like sand through an hourglass. You start with a full tank up here, as it were, and then the time starts to slowly run on it. And, you know, what happens inevitably, and this is not particular to Donald Trump, this is just particular to presidents, is that the time slowly begins to wind down, and then eventually people are saying, well, who's the next president?
And we'll get to that, by the way.
Yeah. So that kind of thing starts. So in other words, you need to make the most of your opening rounds here, at which I think it's very safe to say Donald Trump is doing.
Have you seen anything like this? I mean, the overall pace is dizzying.
The thing that it reminds me of, and I certainly wasn't here, is Franklin Roosevelt's first 100 days.
And that really was the inauguration of the concept of the first 100 days, wasn't it?
Yes. He was very much the activist. And of course, the country was in the grips of the Great Depression. So they were ready. And just, you know, in the personal qualities, Herbert Hoover is as brilliant as he was said to be, was sort of a dour personality. And FDR was the happy-go-lucky guy with the cigarette and all this sort of stuff. And you know, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and it was quite the deal. But other than that, it's hard to think of this. But wow, President Trump is really wowed them.
Off to a big start. Paul, you have a unique perspective as a historian on this whole matter. Tell us how that first 100 days start looks to you and where you think it might be headed.
Yeah, well, quite
How do you
fittingly.
maintain momentum?
Yeah, so I have an anecdote and an illustration about that. So I have a copy of the American Spectator right here, and So, by the way, we're giving them out for free at the Institute for Faith and Freedom table, so get a copy. We brought about 200 copies. But we were planning the next print edition, and we knew that it had to be on Trump's 100 days. I mean, what else are you going to talk about, right? And so we were trying to, we knew that it was the most active 100 days since FDR, maybe even more active than FDR, more shocking. I mean, Sleepy Joe could never do anything like this, right? This is like the first 100 days on steroids. So we were trying to think, so the magazine, each article in the magazine is about the first 100 days. And we were trying to think, how would you illustrate it with a caricature on the cover? So we worked with our cartoonist, Yogi Love, and we thought, what are we going to show? And so we ended up, I'll show you the cover again in a minute, but at one point, Yogi did an illustration of Trump in a swamp. And he's got hip waders on and a hat, and everything's being drained, and you got skulls over here, and one says Department of Education, one says DEI, one says USAID, and it was really good. We ended up putting it on the cover, but it's in the magazine. Another, at one point, we pictured him like the CEO visiting an assembly line, churning out executive orders, right? So we thought of that as well. The one that we settled on is just this. It's the globe, and Trump is on top of it with the with the desk in the Oval Office, and he's holding up an executive order, right? And in a way, he's got a stack of different things that he signed, different signatures, and the title is "Breaking and Making the World," and that's kind of what's going on right now. And even with something as most recent as the tariff issue. I find it very ironic you guys were at Newsmax on the floor of the stock exchange the last couple days on Thursday and Friday. What was that like? So even with the markets, I mean, all three yesterday were, it sounds like a giant number to say it's down by 2,000 points. I mean, we're old enough to remember that would have been like a 30% drop in the stock market. But it's about 5% across the board, and it's substantial. It's a big deal, but he believes that with tariffs, you have to kind of break it in order to make it, right? A lot of the tariffs, and I'm a Reagan free trade guy. I don't like this at all. But on the other hand, a lot of what he's doing with tariffs, these are reciprocal, right? Canada, he feels his tariffs milk too high. So in order to get it down, you got to do something tit for tat to try to get them to take it down. China, you don't like what China is doing here, so you got to take on China on that issue. Don't like what's going on. The Ford CEO had some positive comments in the last 24 hours. He likes what's going on. So a lot of this is the idea of breaking in order to make it better. And he's doing it now while he has the time, while he has the Republican Congress, frankly. You mentioned the Department of Education. Ronald Reagan wanted to get rid of the Department of Education, but he couldn't because he didn't have the Republican Congress to do it. By the way, when was the Department of Education created?
Jimmy Carter.
79, Jimmy Carter. And people talk like it's etched in the Liberty Bell over in Philadelphia somewhere, right? Like it was created by Jefferson and Madison and Department of Treasury and Department of Education. So this, it's a menace and it deserves to go. It's time for it to go. But to try to do it now, this is really, Trump understands Reagan couldn't get it done because Reagan didn't have the Republican Congress. Trump is trying to do it now while he has a Republican Congress, and frankly, probably won't be able to because he probably doesn't have the votes. But I think that's all part of breaking and making. That seems to be the strategy of the first 100 days, and simply, too, just reversing a lot of what the liberals have done in politicizing and ideologizing agencies and departments that should have never been treated that way to begin with.
Great, thank you, Paul. John, first 100 days.
I would agree with Jeff that this resembles most closely Franklin D. Roosevelt's first 100 days, but there are two significant differences. One, FDR had Democratic-controlled House and Senate by resounding numbers. Voters in 1930 rejected Republicans in the midterm elections during the Depression, and in 1932, in electing Governor Roosevelt by a landslide, gave him comfortable margins in the House and Senate. Interestingly, much of the Roosevelt agenda was actually passed with Republican votes in Congress. Bernard Snell, who was the Republican leader in the House, said at one point, if the president asked us to commit suicide, a lot of us would probably do it. Now, one other factor I would say, that in winning narrow control of the House and Senate in the last elections, Donald Trump led a movement that only 4 times before has emerged triumphant in the election. That is with a Republican president and both houses of Congress in their hands. I should say 4 times in the last century, 1928 with Herbert Hoover's election, 1952 with Dwight Eisenhower bringing in a Republican House and Senate, and of course, George W. Bush winning re-election in '04 with Republican majorities in both houses, and then Donald Trump's first election in 2016. The common denominator is that in the midterm election, these majorities were lost subsequently, and the opportunity was missed. The door was closed. Hence, the efforts to move quickly now on abolishing departments, putting in trade measures, and moving ahead with a revolutionary agenda. He's got only a small opening to do this. It should be pointed out the House is the most closely divided since 1930 in terms of the Republicans and Democratic split. That means the president needs every Republican vote, something he made clear in his address to Congress. The good news for Donald Trump is that for the most part, with very few, if any, exceptions, Republicans in the House, and certainly in the Senate with only 2 exceptions, are going to follow him on this agenda. So he is, should we say, in a comfortable position now.
Let's return to this matter of tariffs in the context of the Republican Congress, the narrow majorities in both the House and the Senate, and the traditional pattern that the first midterm election after a presidential election has a tendency to go the other way. In the tariff package, and I'm with you, Paul, in terms of being a Reagan free trader, but we need to give this bold initiative at least the opportunity to be proven out. But there's a pain component and a promise component. The pain component can be felt virtually immediately. I got a call the other day from a dear friend who was worried about his 401k and whether Trump was going to screw his retirement. Well, that's a pain that is being felt yesterday and Monday with a 2,000-point drop forecast on the futures markets and so on. And yet the promise side of the tariff package is the return of manufacturing and the increase in employment, the building of factories and all of that stuff. That takes time. And between now and when factories can be built and people hired and manufacturing restored comes 2026. How can this administration and this president successfully negotiate the path between now and 2026?
Well, one of the things I would say, and for those of you who have been in Harrisburg on the grounds of the state capitol, there was a statue of one Boyce Penrose, who was the longtime United States Senator from Pennsylvania. And the boss, exactly. And Boyce Penrose, if he was famous for nothing else, it was tariffs. That was his big deal. And Pennsylvania was very much a pro-tariff state. And I remember in my own experience that there was pressure on Senator John Hines, for whom I was working at the time, to get on the ball with tariffs and all of this kind of thing. And the pressure was coming from people in the steel industry in Western Pennsylvania and that sort of thing. So I think that there may be more of a natural base for this in this state than you might think.
Interesting perspective.
Yeah, in fitness, right, there's the phrase, no pain, no gain. So, I mean, and clearly, this is a calculated thing to get it done right now. And Colin, like you said, because November 2026 looms. So you don't want the pain to still be there in November 2026, right? You want this to be short term.
Or at least have the promise, even if you're still suffering the pain, have the promise on the horizon.
Right.
How can you build factories and restore manufacturing and increase manufacturing employment in time? That takes a while.
It does,
The pain
yeah.
takes very little time. The promise takes a long time.
Yeah, and you have to factor it into your planning. And I mean, right now, look at Jeff's point too on Penrose and John Hines and 1980s. Look, Ronald Reagan used tariffs to protect Harley Davidson.
That's right.
A lot of people forget about that. The steel industry, the steel workers union, did they endorse Trump? They did not. Yeah, neutral, that's right. They decided not to endorse the Democrat, which was itself just a giant thing. But there's a fascinating component going on here. It used to be the Democrats for a while that were considered the party of the working class, right? The coal miner, the steel worker, the auto worker. Donald Trump has completely taken that away. I mean, now the Democratic Party is the liberal party. It's the party of Silicon Valley, of Harvard, of Columbia, right? The protesters at Columbia, of the elites. And all of a sudden here, Donald Trump and the Republican Party, and I know you want to talk about this later, but even people like J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, they're all in for this too. This is really transforming the Republican Party into that party of the working class. And it's going to make states like Pennsylvania probably vote Republican for president. It's still going to be close, but the political ramifications of this are significant. And also, too, you got to give Donald Trump credit. He is a businessman. He does understand business. Joe Biden didn't. Kamala Harris didn't. And so does he understands the stock market. Does he know that this is going to have this kind of effect? Yeah. And in the interim as well, it will be inflationary. It will add to inflation because adding tariffs increases prices. But the plan is you bite the bullet now with the promise of longer term gains, hopefully by 2026, hopefully before that, hopefully well before November 2026.
One of the things that I remember when I worked with President Reagan, I was invited, on the staff to come along. He was coming to York to the Harley Davidson factory, and it was an amazing thing. Here is the President of the United States walking around the plant floor, and all these working folks were giving him hurrahs and showing him what they did and all this. And then he stood on a makeshift stage and talked about tariffs, and that he was not going to settle for the Japanese, I think it was in the day, putting tariffs on motorcycles without result. So he was pretty determined on that kind of thing.
Just as a postscript on this, when I was in Argentina in December of 2023 for the inauguration of President Javier Milei, I conducted man-on-the-street interviews, and so many people I spoke to, including twins, women, who were one an ophthalmologist, one an optometrist, young, upward rising people. And they said they knew things will get bad before they get better. And they said, but that's what you have to endure when you're trying to upend 80 years of socialism. And sure enough, President Milei has taken some drastic steps. Tell me if this sounds familiar. On his first day in office, he fired 70,000 federal government employees and shut down 11 of 18 cabinet ministries, all of which he could do with an executive order, none of which is interconnected with the rest of the world. And guess what? After more than a year in office, President Milei's support is still the same. Just over half the country backs what he's doing at this point. So I think This is almost an example. In a way, you could say Millet is blazing the trail for Donald Trump.
That's actually a really good analogy. And in fact, 70,000 that they could even have that many federal workers in that country. It's unbelievable. It really shows you. But with Donald Trump, too, look at his approval rating. It is basically where it always is about 48%, right? So he's not gonna get 60%. Right. This election, this victory that he had back in November, it was a big victory. What was the Electoral College? 312, 226, something like that. But I don't think in the end he got over 50% of the overall vote. It might have just ducked right below 50.
It was just below the overall percentage, as many Democrats like to remind me.
Right, which is a shame. Ronald Reagan won 49 out of 50 states, right? He won 60% of the vote. He won the Electoral College 525 to 13. So this isn't, Trump's victory wasn't anything like that. But on the other hand, it was a substantial Electoral College victory, and he won every single swing state, every single one of them. And sometimes it's just a matter of winning. Those Steelers Super Bowls from the 1970s, I think they beat the Cowboys by 4 both times, right? But you still win both of them. People don't often remember the final score. Sometimes you just have to win. And in his case, he doesn't need to be over 50% approval because he has 4 years, no matter what.
I would compare it to the elections of 1860 and 1968 in the sense that the Republican candidate for president won without a majority, but he was so different from what the people had elected 4 years previously that it could truly be called a seismic shift in American politics.
From LBJ in the Great Society to Nixon. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And from James Buchanan to the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Pennsylvania's only president.
Right.
I've been to his
Paul,
home.
you put your finger on another important change, which is the working class vote and how the Democrat Party has always positioned itself in our lifetimes as the party of the working class. And yet, this last election, Donald Trump did extremely well with the working class as the Democrat Party moved further and further away from it into a kind of a self-defeating elitism. My question for you as a historian and as an observer of trends in America and somebody who's also on a college campus, what's happening on college campuses now? Are they in fact more conservative than any college campus cadre in the last 20 or 30 years? And where is that headed? Is this something that is a truly short-term phenomenon related somehow to Donald Trump's persona? Or is there something happening out there in the way of political realignment where this is only the beginning of it?
Well, so Grove City College is a complete anomaly.
Yes,
right?
I know, but you
Not
go to
like
other campuses.
Right, but no, it's true. I speak at a lot of college campuses, and Trump did really well among young voters. And the group to really watch out for are like current teenage boys, right? Young men. And they have really had it with all the wokeism and DEI and everything. I mean, those guys are probably more conservative, I think, than any of the other generations in the last 30 or 40 years. How many of you saw the viral video that was posted of the woke woman on the subway in New York harassing the kid with the MAGA hat, right?
Yes.
And she just keeps going after him. And there's a black guy sitting there, and he's like, he says to her, "Leave the kid alone. I voted for Trump too," right? It's because of people like you that he won. And she just keeps going after this kid, calling him a racist. He's like, "Why am I a racist?" And then finally she chases him off the subway, right? And she runs out, chases him down, or tries to chase him down. She fell flat on her face at a face plant. And then his buddy takes a picture while she fell. It's a crazy thing. It's a really funny thing. But my wife said, "You got to see this." And she showed it, and she said, "This looks like our son John, the kid wearing the hat being chased out of there. He looks like almost any 16, 18-year-old boy running around in America today, even in Manhattan. So they really had it with wokeism, DEI, critical race theory, and Trump has tapped into that. So that, I think, is indeed an encouraging sign for the Republicans in the future, and bad for the Democrats. What are the Democrats doing? They just want to double down on it. Well, we haven't done enough CRT. We haven't done enough DEI. If we just had Kamala in, we could have done all. Go ahead, keep going. Keep doing it, keep going. You're going to lose.
One of the problems that President Trump has is dealing with the swamp, so-called. And the way the swamp works, I always say, is my analogy, is a congressman wakes up in the morning and finds out that his 5-year-old has a runny nose. So he goes into his office, has his legislative staff write a bill establishing the Department of Children with Runny Noses. It passes because of who, of course, wants to not help children with runny noses. So it passes, they build a 10-story building in the middle of Washington, fill it with unionized employees who are all earning 6 figures, and then they go on to the next problem. That's the way it works, and that really is a problem there that President Trump, or any president for that matter, but certainly one as inclined as Donald Trump, has to deal with.
And then you can't get rid of the Department of Runny Nose, or you're a fascist, and
That's right.
a hater, and a racist.
That's right. I mean, the education department, good Lord. What can I say? My own late mom, bless her, worked for the Pennsylvania State Department of Education. You know, enough said. We don't need to federalize the whole thing.
Right.
John, how about your perspective on this realignment question?
Well, first, let me just add a postscript to what Jeff said. We've talked a lot about the Department of Education this morning. The 1980 Republican platform not only called for abolishing the Department of Education, but the Departments of Commerce, Energy, and Housing and Urban Development. And as Paul could certainly expatiate on, Sam Pierce, the only one of Reagan's cabinet members to serve all 8 years, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, would turn in a budget every year smaller than the previous year, to the point that by the time he completed his tenure as Secretary of HUD, the department was 2/3 smaller than when it came in. And he was one of the few who, using the scalpel that I mentioned earlier, rather than a sledgehammer, came very close to shutting down a government agency. And of course, then our late friend Jack Kemp became Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and its budget skyrocketed once again. Now,
And by the way, they ridiculed Sam Pierce. They called him Silent Sam.
Right.
Like he was a do-nothing lackey. And he's one of the only ones who, using that like surgical scalpel approach, cut his department.
right. And to answer your question, Colin, and follow up on the realignment, there's no doubt that the realignment occurs. I would add just a caveat to that, in the sense that Donald Trump carried areas, notably in the state of Michigan, that were blue collar, that were Democratic. Hamtramck, Michigan, which has a substantial Muslim population, went for Trump, and in many cases, the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein, many precincts in Hamtramck was coming in ahead of Kamala Harris. So one is seeing some unusual trends. Here in Pennsylvania, I've been to Amish country outside of Lancaster, and people say the Amish went for Donald Trump. So we could see a realignment in ways that are not apparent or cultivated. Last night, Kayleigh said that Trump increased his percentage of the vote among Black Americans. In fact, in the end, it was 20%, which is the most a Republican nominee received from Black voters since Richard Nixon in 1960.
Yeah.
And Hispanic votes, Trump set the record, 48% of the Hispanic vote.
Yeah, by the way, if I could add, when I was, I don't know if this gentleman is here today, but when I was here last year, And I asked him, he represented Latino voters, and I said, reasonably, come on, what do you think Trump could get? And I said, do you think he could possibly get 30, 35? And he said, oh yeah, 30, 35%, yeah. And he said, it could be as high as 40. There you go. Yeah. And he way outperformed that, didn't he? And that was really significant.
But Colin, let me just add a postscript and a potential warning. Donald Trump led the Republican ticket everywhere. In my late wife's home state of Michigan, he won by a bigger margin than he did in 1980, when it took until the early morning to determine the votes of the Wolverine state. Mike Rogers, Republican nominee for the Senate, former congressman, decorated U.S. Army veteran, and FBI agent, outstanding five-star candidate, wound up losing, albeit in the closest election in Michigan in the history of popular elections, 0.1% of the vote. In Wisconsin, a similar situation occurred, where Eric Hovde, a businessman and an outsider, lost an election that was determined the next morning, actually. So we are seeing this. Donald Trump had Republicans in districts where he led nonetheless lose some close races to dislodge Democratic incumbents. I could go on about this, but is the Republican Party, I ask you, changing and realigning for Donald Trump or for the party itself? This is a question we're going to have to discuss and ponder in the long run.
And that's a question I really want to expand on. Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, one of the things I would observe is that in 1980, we saw, particularly in Michigan, the term that came to be used was the Reagan Democrat.
Right.
And they were blue-collar folks. And I think now they're still there. You might call them Trump Democrats now.
That's true, but there was a different relationship between philosophy and personality with Reagan than with Trump.
Yes.
And therefore, the question naturally arises, who comes after Trump? Who comes after Reagan was a question that more or less answered itself. Who comes after Trump is a huge question.
One of the things
because
that,
there's no one like him.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is very important, and it's a president's responsibility, and it's not in the Constitution, and that is to be the leader of their party. And to be the leader of either the Republican or the Democratic Party means you need to be bringing along your heirs, as it were. And
How
I think
is Trump doing in that department?
And I think he's doing, I mean, there is Marco Rubio, there is J.D. Vance, there's a whole collection of others, and probably some that we don't even know at the moment who haven't been elected to anything,
Right.
but may emerge in 2026 as the new governor or senator from somewhere. So I think, he's doing pretty well with that.
I think it'll be Vance and Rubio. They'll be the kind of ideological heirs, and they'll be much more like Donald Trump than George H.W. Bush was like Reagan.
Yes.
When George H.W. Bush, why did he win? Because it was the closest anybody could get to a third term of Reagan.
Right.
He was Reagan's vice president. And then he lost when he basically went back on his no new taxes pledge, which the worst Reagan people in the White House, Jim Baker, Dick Darman, David Gergen, who am I forgetting? The pragmatists, right? They followed Bush, and then they convinced him, especially Dick Darman, hey, go back on the no new taxes pledge. It won't matter. It won't matter, right? And he lost. And because of that, and because of Ross Perot, we would have never heard of someone named Bill and Hillary Clinton if that was the case. But Vance and Rubio are going to be a lot more like Trump, especially with this middle class Reagan Democrat kind of group, than George H.W. Bush was like Reagan.
Yeah.
Very good perception. Thank you. John.
I would never dare try to amend the remarks of Professor Kengor, or much less correct him. Ross Perot in 1992, it is a myth that he took votes from George H.W. Bush, perpetrated by President Bush himself and Dan Quayle, among others, but totally disproved by reports. The final poll showed the pro vote would have either split evenly between the two major candidates, or many pro voters would not have voted at all.
Because they were independents.
Independent.
Yeah.
Ross Perot, very much a pro-choice candidate, made it clear he would have never named Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court, and never ruled out a tax increase, by the way. I would say Bill Clinton probably would have won an even more decisive vote in the popular vote than as he did in the Electoral College that year.
But not 50% of the vote. What do you think?
Again, going back, it's the old saying, if my mother didn't have me, I wouldn't be born. I can't really say on that, but I would say Bill Clinton's election was inevitable, and I would compare it very much to Clement Attlee leading the Labor Party to defeat Churchill.
Yeah.
Voters were upset about the domestic situation as much as they may have admired the leader on the international situation. Now,
By the way, Attlee got 49% of the vote.
Again, right? Now, one more thing, I would, on the realignment, James Baker, Bush's Secretary of State, Reagan's Chief of Staff, once famously said, "Overnight is an eternity in politics." I never know what's going to happen in politics a year down the line, let alone 4 years down the line.
Right.
It would seem logical at this time that J.D. Vance would be the Republican nominee. And there's a whole who's who of Republicans who could be his running mate. Marco Rubio, Sarah Sanders, the governor of Arkansas, who is an up-and-coming figure, and of course, Pennsylvania's own Senator Dave McCormick. And mark my words, he's going to start to be mentioned for national office very soon by a lot of people. But again, I don't know. After President Nixon was reelected in 1972, everyone I knew said Vice President Agnew would be would be the Republican nominee in 4 years. And of course, he got caught up in a scandal and resigned from office October 10th, 1973, my mom's birthday. And that led overnight to Ronald Reagan being resuscitated as a possible candidate. I thought Reagan would be the nominee for sure in 1976. I never believed Gerald Ford, who'd never been elected to anything outside of Grand Rapids, would even run for president. He said in his confirmation hearings as vice president, "I will honor my promise to my wife, step down and go home in 1976 and won't run for president." So much is unexpected down the line. We just buried a fellow named Jimmy Carter. Who thought that he would be nominated, much less elected president in 1976? His own mother said, when he told her he was running for president, she said, "President of what?"
Yeah.
And Gerald Ford couldn't even beat Carter. How's that?
In one of the more gruesome historical situations, in the early fall of 1963, the pollsters were asking, who would President Kennedy be facing for re-election? Barry Goldwater, Nelson Rockefeller, et cetera. Then, of course, there was that fateful trip to Dallas, and America wound up a year later dealing with Lyndon Johnson in the White House, and it was a whole different scenario. So, never count that tomorrow is going to be the same as today.
Well, our time is running short. That's a great way for us to perhaps frame our final remarks. What's next? Even, it's so hard to predict, but what's next, even in the next year? Is Donald Trump's leadership going to be challenged by the courts in a way that completely upends its momentum, or is there going to be a continued shift of power towards the executive?
Go ahead.
Presidents have fought the courts for decades, even centuries. If you go back, Andrew Jackson famously fought the courts over the U.S. bank at the time. And a line that's attributed to him, but I think is apocryphal, is John Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. Franklin Roosevelt lost badly in the courts, which struck down most of his New Deal, the Supreme Court, in fact, and he attempted to enlarge it, setting the stage for future Democrats to talk about enlarging the court, but in the end being unsuccessful. Yes, there will be a clash in courts, and the president's job, and this places great importance on the Solicitor General, I think, and the Justice Department, will then try to take all of these cases to the U.S. Supreme Court, where I'm sure the Trump White House feels it will finally get its good day in court. And this will be protracted over a period of time, but it will be fought very much so in this term of Donald Trump's.
You know, could I make a providential point here?
Please.
We're in Pennsylvania, and my hometown is Butler, Pennsylvania.
Oh, my.
Class of 1984. And a bunch of people in here were at that rally. My 16-year-old son was at that rally. That was a terrifying moment for his mother and I. Jeff Lord said, watch it on Newsmax. They're covering the whole thing. I was going to cover it for American Spectator. It was a hot day. I decided not to. And I'm watching, and I saw those bullets fly. My wife just dropped to her knees and started praying. And it took about half an hour to get a hold of our son because they scrambled the cell phones. We couldn't get a hold of them. But ever since that moment, Donald Trump has said, and I follow this stuff because I write books on the faith of presidents, at least 100 times he said that he believed that God spared his life on that day. He called RFK Jr. and he said, how important is your faith to you? And RFK Jr. said, well, it's the central organizing force in my life. And Trump said, I feel that way now too.
Wow.
So he was never an atheist. He had believed in God, but now he has this sense of mission that he was saved for a special purpose. And like Ronald Reagan, after Reagan was shot March 30th, 1981, he feels that God has spared him in order to do something significant. He's got 4 years to do it, and he doesn't care right now what anybody says about anything that he's doing. He's going to get it done. And that's a very powerful sense of purpose and mission that I think we got to watch going forward.
Well, the sign in the back of the room says stop. I could sit here with these gentlemen for the next 2 hours, but unfortunately, we must do as the sign says and stop. But please express your appreciation to the three of us.